At 29, Clara Whitfield had $43, a canvas duffel bag, and nowhere else to go. The day after her husband died, his mother had made it clear the apartment lease wouldn't be renewed. His brother had made it clearer that she wasn't family anymore. But Earl Whitfield's will had left her something his children hadn't expected. Whitfield Hardware on Route 9 in Cedar Falls, a store that had been shuttered for 3 years. When the lawyer read those lines, Clara's sister-in-law had actually laughed. "Good luck with that pile of rust," she'd said. But when Clara pried open the false panel behind the customer counter, she found something Earl had spent 15 years quietly building. Something his own children had spent just as long making sure she would never find. The lawyer's office had smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. Margaret Whitfield sat in the chair nearest the window, her reading glasses catching the afternoon light as she examined her copy of the will. Her son David drummed his fingers on the conference table, checking his phone every 30 seconds. Clara sat at the far end, still wearing the black dress from the funeral 2 days before. "The house on Maple Street goes to Margaret," the lawyer read. "The Ford pickup and all tools contained therein go to David." Margaret nodded. David stopped drumming his fingers. "And to Clara Marie Whitfield, I leave Whitfield Hardware, located at 412 Route 9, Cedar Falls, including all inventory, fixtures, and real property." The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. "That old place?" David said. "Dad hasn't opened that store since Mom got sick. It's probably full of mice." "The roof leaks," Margaret added. "Earl spent more on repairs than he ever made in sales those last 2 years. Clara pressed the will against her chest. She hadn't expected anything. Tom had been gone 6 months when his father died of the heart attack, and she'd felt like a stranger at both funerals. The family had been polite but distant, the kind of distant that made you understand you were temporary, even after 7 years of marriage. "The building's probably worth something to a developer," David said. "You could sell it, split the money 3 ways." "That's not what the will says." Clara folded the papers in half. "It says it's mine." Margaret removed her glasses and cleaned them with a tissue. "Clara, honey, you don't know the first thing about running a hardware store. Earl could barely keep it going, and he'd been in business 40 years. "Maybe she wants to try," the lawyer said. "With what money?" David laughed. "You know how much it costs to heat that place in winter? The electric bill alone would eat her alive." Clara stood up and walked to the window. Below, the parking lot was full of trucks and sedans belonging to people who had somewhere to go when the meeting ended. She'd given notice at the diner where she worked, thinking she'd need time to grieve. Now she had time, and no job, and no apartment, and a sister-in-law who thought helping was the same as pity. "I'll take the store," she said without turning around. Margaret sighed. "Clara, I'll take it." She signed the papers with a pen that skipped ink. David shook his head and muttered something about property taxes. Margaret hugged her at the door, the kind of hug that felt like goodbye. Clara walked out of the building with her duffel bag, the keys to Whitfield Hardware, and the knowledge that she had maybe 3 weeks before she'd be sleeping in her car. The drive took 40 minutes. Main Street turned into Route 9, which started as 4 lanes of gas stations and chain restaurants before narrowing to 2 lanes of farmland and scattered houses. The road climbed through rolling hills covered in oak and maple trees just starting to turn. Clara had made this drive dozens of times when Tom was alive, visiting his parents. But she'd never paid attention to the landscape. Now she noticed everything. The red barn with the collapsing roof, the creek that ran parallel to the road, the hand-painted sign advertising fresh eggs. The GPS told her to turn right in half a mile. She almost missed the store. Whitfield Hardware sat back from the road behind a gravel parking lot with grass growing through the stones. The building was painted dark green with white trim around the windows, though the paint was faded and peeling in places. A wooden sign hung from 2 chains above the front door. Whitfield Hardware, since 1987. One of the chains had snapped, leaving the sign tilted at an angle. Clara pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. The silence was different here than in town. No traffic, no air conditioners, no distant highway noise. Just wind in the trees and a mourning dove calling from somewhere behind the building. She got out of the car and walked to the front door. The keys were on a ring with a brass tag that said Earl in block letters. The lock turned easily, as if it had been oiled recently. The front door opened with a soft chime from a bell mounted on the top rail. Clara stepped inside and reached for the light switch. Fluorescent tubes flickered on overhead, casting harsh white light over everything. The store was smaller than she remembered. 4 narrow aisles ran from front to back, lined with metal shelving that reached almost to the ceiling. The shelves were still stocked. Boxes of screws and bolts, coils of rope and chain, hand tools hanging from pegboard hooks, paint cans arranged by color, packages of PVC pipe fittings, rolls of sandpaper, bottles of wood glue and penetrating oil. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but nothing looked damaged or disturbed. Behind the customer counter, a wooden chair sat beside an old cash register with mechanical keys. Clara walked around the counter and sat down in the chair. It creaked under her weight. From here she could see the entire store. The entrance with its rack of work gloves, the aisle of plumbing supplies, the back corner where fishing line and hooks hung in neat rows above a cooler that probably once held bait. She opened the duffel bag and pulled out the things she'd taken from the apartment. A change of clothes, a toothbrush, the photograph of her and Tom at the lake, a paperback novel with a bent cover, and a bag of peanut butter crackers she'd grabbed from the vending machine at the lawyer's office. She ate 3 crackers and drank water from a coffee mug she found on a shelf behind the register. The water tasted metallic, but it was cold. The sun was setting by the time she finished walking through the store. In the back room she found cases of motor oil, bags of road salt, and a pegboard covered with spare keys for every lock in the building. A narrow staircase led up to what looked like a storage loft. She climbed the stairs and found a small room with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the hills behind the store. Earl had lived here those last few years, she realized, after his wife died and he'd sold the house. Clara made a peanut butter sandwich for dinner and ate it sitting on the bed. Through the window she could see lights coming on in farmhouses scattered across the valley. A train whistle echoed from somewhere far away. She thought about calling David to tell him she'd made it safely, but she didn't have his number and wasn't sure he'd want to know anyway. She was brushing her teeth in the small bathroom when she noticed it. The customer counter was built from pine planks painted white, with a solid front panel that ran from the floor to the countertop. But one section of the panel, maybe 18 inches wide, sat differently than the rest. The wood grain didn't match. The paint was newer, applied over older paint. And when Clara ran her hand along the bottom edge, she felt something that made her kneel down for a closer look. The panel was held in place by 4 screws, but they weren't the same screws as the rest of the counter. These were newer, Phillips head instead of flathead, and they'd been turned recently. The brass was bright, not tarnished like the others. Clara went to the tool section and found a screwdriver with a worn wooden handle. She knelt behind the counter and fit the tip into the first screw. It turned easily, too easily, as if it had been loosened and retightened many times. The other 3 screws came out just as smoothly. The panel swung open on hidden hinges. Inside was a cavity about 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, carved out of the space between the counter and the wall. Clara reached for the flashlight she'd seen hanging near the cash register and shined it into the opening. A metal lockbox sat on a wooden shelf, along with a stack of papers tied with string and a manila envelope with her name written on the front in careful cursive, for Clara Marie Whitfield. Below her name, in smaller letters, When you're ready to know the truth. Clara's hands shook as she pulled the envelope from the shelf. She sat on the floor with her back against the counter and tore open the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. She unfolded it and read, "Clara, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you found your way to the store. I hope it wasn't too hard getting here. I know my children weren't kind to you after Tom died. They weren't kind to him either, those last years. Some people think love is something you deserve instead of something you give. This letter is the first of many. Behind the panel, you'll find a key and an address. The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Cedar Falls. The address is for a storage unit out on County Road 4. Everything I couldn't tell you while I was alive is waiting there. Tom loved you more than he ever loved anything, but he was afraid to disappoint me and his mother. He wanted to bring you into the business, teach you everything he'd learned, but Margaret said it wasn't proper work for a young woman. I should have stood up to her. I should have stood up to her about a lot of things. The store is yours now, really yours. Not because Tom is gone, but because you're the only one who understood what it meant to him. You saw how his face changed when he talked about fixing something that was broken, making something that would last. Margaret and David see the store as a burden. You might see it as a beginning. Take your time with the rest. I left instructions in the lockbox. There's more than you think, Clara. More than anyone thinks. With love and regret, Earl Whitfield, P.S. The coffee maker in the back room still works. Tom always said you made the best coffee in 3 counties. Clara read the letter twice before folding it and holding it against her chest. The store was quiet around her, nothing but the hum of the old refrigerator in the back room and the tick of a wall clock somewhere in the darkness. She reached into the cavity and pulled out the lockbox. It was heavy, maybe 10 pounds, and locked with a small brass padlock. The key was exactly where Earl had said it would be, tied to a string and taped to the back wall of the hiding place. Clara unlocked the box and lifted the lid. Inside were more letters, dozens of them, each in its own envelope with a date written in the corner. The oldest was from 8 years ago, just after she and Tom had gotten married. The newest was dated 3 weeks before Earl died. Underneath the letters was a worn leather journal and a brass key attached to a tag that read, Storage Unit 47, County Road 4. Clara opened the most recent letter. It was written in the same careful cursive, but the handwriting was shakier, less certain. Clara. The doctors say I have maybe a month. I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm afraid of leaving you with nothing but a building and a bunch of old inventory. Margaret and David think the store is worthless. They think you're worthless too, though they're too polite to say it where you can hear. They're wrong about both. In the storage unit, you'll find everything I saved for you and Tom. The plans he drew for expanding the store. The money I set aside every month for 20 years. Money Margaret never knew about. The furniture he made in the back room when he couldn't sleep. Pieces he was too shy to show anyone but me. But most important, you'll find the letters I wrote to both of you every year on your anniversary. Letters I never sent because I didn't know how to say I was proud without admitting I'd been wrong about so many things. Tom is gone, and I'll be gone soon. But the love doesn't go anywhere, Clara. It stays in the wood he cut and sanded and joined with his own hands. It stays in the tools he cleaned and sharpened and organized just the way his grandfather taught him. It stays in this building he dreamed of making into something beautiful. The store is your inheritance. The rest is your dowry. E.W. Clara sat in the darkness behind the counter, holding Earl's letters and listening to the building settle around her. Somewhere in the walls, the old wood creaked and sighed. The coffee maker gurgled to life in the back room, though she hadn't touched it. Outside, a car passed on Route 9, its headlights sweeping across the front windows before disappearing into the night. She thought about Tom, How he used to run his hands along the edges of boards to check for splinters. How he'd spend an hour sharpening a chisel until the blade caught light like a mirror. She thought about the plans Earl mentioned, and the furniture hidden in a storage unit, and the money that Margaret and David knew nothing about. But mostly she thought about the phrase Earl had used, "When you're ready to know the truth." As if the truth was something that could wait, something that grew more bearable with time. As if love was a kind of archaeology, buried in layers that only revealed themselves when you had the tools to dig carefully enough not to break what you found. Clara folded the letters and put them back in the lockbox. Tomorrow she would drive to the bank and the storage unit. Tomorrow she would start to understand what Tom and his father had been building in secret, what they'd been saving for a future they'd never live to see. Tonight she would sleep in Earl's narrow bed and listen to the sounds of a building that had sheltered 3 generations of Whitfields. A building that was hers now in ways she was only beginning to understand. She locked the cash register, turned off the lights, and climbed the stairs to the small room above the store. Through the window she could see stars scattered across the valley, bright and still in the clear mountain air. She set the lockbox on the dresser beside the photograph of her and Tom, and changed into the extra clothes from her duffel bag. Before she lay down, Clara opened the lockbox one more time and touched the brass key that would unlock the storage unit. Whatever Tom and Earl had hidden there, whatever they'd saved and planned and dreamed, it belonged to her now. Not because she deserved it, but because love doesn't end when people die. It just changes form, becomes something you can hold in your hands and build on and pass along to the next person who needs somewhere to start. Clara woke to the sound of a delivery truck grinding gears on Route 9. Sunlight streamed through the small window, casting rectangles of gold across the wooden floor. She'd slept better than she had in months, despite the unfamiliar bed and the strange creaking sounds the building made as it warmed in the morning sun. She dressed quickly and walked downstairs to the main floor of the store. In daylight, everything looked different. The dust wasn't as thick as she'd thought, and someone had recently restocked the shelves in the plumbing section. A pegboard near the paint display held new packages of brushes and rollers, still in their plastic wrapping. Clara made instant coffee with water from the tap and ate the rest of her peanut butter crackers standing behind the counter. The brass key to the storage unit sat heavy in her pocket, but first she needed to understand more about the store itself, about the business Earl had left her. She needed to understand Cedar Falls. The drive into town took 12 minutes on winding roads that followed Willow Creek through pastures dotted with black cattle. Cedar Falls announced itself with a green highway sign and a cluster of white church steeples rising above maple trees. Main Street was 4 blocks of brick buildings housing a post office, a diner, a bank, a pharmacy, and Brennan's Hardware. Clara parked in front of the diner and sat in her car for a moment, watching people move along the sidewalks. An old man in overalls carried a paper bag from the pharmacy. 2 women in their 50s stood talking outside the post office, one holding a package wrapped in brown paper. A teenage boy loaded bags of feed into the back of a pickup truck, parked outside Brennan's Hardware. She walked into the diner and took a seat at the counter. A woman in her 60s appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a white apron. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes were the color of cornflower blue. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for the pot. "Please." The woman filled a thick white mug and set it in front of Clara. "You're Earl Whitfield's daughter-in-law." It wasn't a question. Clara nodded and wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "How did you know?" "Earl talked about you, said you had good hands and a quick mind." The woman extended her hand across the counter. "I'm Rose Brennan. My husband runs the hardware store across the street." "Clara Whitfield. I inherited Earl's place." Rose leaned against the counter and studied Clara's face. You planning to open it back up? I'm thinking about it. Earl kept that store running on determination and duct tape those last few years. Good man, but he was stubborn about asking for help. Rose refilled Clara's coffee without being asked. You hungry? I make a decent breakfast. Clara ordered scrambled eggs and toast, though she only had enough money for coffee. Rose brought the plate without mentioning payment and sat down on the stool behind the register. Earl used to come in here every Tuesday morning for coffee and pie, Rose said. Always sat in the booth by the window so he could keep an eye on his truck. We'd talk about the weather, the town council meetings, whose roof leaked in the last storm. But the last few months he seemed worried about something. Worried how? Distracted, like he was working out a problem in his head. Rose stood up and wiped down the counter with a damp rag. He asked me once if I thought young people could still make a living in a place like Cedar Falls. I told him depends on what they're willing to work for. Clara ate her eggs slowly, listening to the rhythm of conversation from the other customers. Two farmers discussed corn prices and rainfall. A woman ordered coffee to go and asked about Sunday's church potluck. The teenager from Brennan's Hardware came in and bought a can of soda, calling Rose Mrs. B, and asking about her grandson's baseball season. When Clara finished eating, Rose brought over a white paper bag. Couple sandwiches for later. Earl always said you worked too hard and didn't eat enough. I can't pay for... Didn't ask you to. Rose tied the bag closed and handed it to Clara. But if you're serious about opening that store, you should talk to my husband. He's got Earl's wholesale accounts, knows which suppliers are honest and which ones will try to cheat you on shipping. Clara took the bag and stood up. Thank you. Bring the truck around back when you need to load supplies, Rose said. Loading dock's easier than trying to carry everything through the front door. Clara walked across the street to Brennan's Hardware. The bell above the door played a different tune than the one at Earl's store, lower and softer. A man with thick white hair and paint-stained work clothes looked up from behind the counter where he was sorting bolts into small cardboard boxes. You'd be Clara, he said. Rose called and said you were coming. Mr. Brennan? Frank. He set down the bolt he was holding and wiped his hands on a rag. Earl was a good friend. I'm sorry for your loss. Frank Brennan had the kind of hands that told stories, scarred from 40 years of handling tools and hardware, strong enough to grip a wrench but gentle enough to thread a tiny screw. He led Clara to a back office filled with catalogs and invoices and pulled out a 3-ring binder. These are Earl's vendor contacts, he said. Paint suppliers, tool distributors, the outfit in Richmond that handled his electrical supplies. Frank flipped through pages of handwritten notes. Earl was old school, kept everything on paper, made deals with handshakes, paid his bills the day they arrived. Clara studied the pages of phone numbers and account codes. Did he make money? Enough. Hardware stores don't make anybody rich, but they keep food on the table if you run them right. Frank closed the binder and handed it to her. Earl ran his right. Why did he close? Frank was quiet for a moment, looking out the window toward the street. His wife got sick, cancer. Last 2 years of her life, Earl spent more time at the hospital than he did at the store. After she died, he couldn't bear to open it back up. Too many memories. Clara held the binder against her chest. His children think I should sell it. His children think a lot of things. Frank's voice was carefully neutral. What do you think? I think Earl left it to me for a reason. Frank nodded and reached under the counter. He pulled out a small cardboard box and handed it to Clara. Inside was a brass door key, worn smooth from years of use. Master key to Earl's store, Frank said. He gave it to me when he closed up. Asked me to keep an eye on the place. I've been checking on it once a month, oiling the locks, making sure the roof hasn't leaked. Clara stared at the key. You've been maintaining his store? Somebody had to. Earl knew he wouldn't live forever. Frank closed the box and pushed it toward her. But I'm 73 years old, and my own store keeps me busy enough. If you're serious about reopening Whitfield Hardware, that key belongs to you. Oh. Clara left Brennan's Hardware with the vendor binder under her arm and Frank's business card in her pocket. The master key felt warm in her hand as she walked back to her car. For the first time since Tom died, she felt like someone was expecting her to succeed instead of waiting for her to fail. The drive to County Road 4 took 20 minutes through farmland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Storage Solutions was a collection of metal buildings arranged in rows behind a chain-link fence. Clara found Unit 47 at the end of the third row, a roll-up door secured with a heavy padlock. The brass key fit perfectly. Clara lifted the handle and rolled the door up into the ceiling. Sunlight flooded into the unit, illuminating something that took her breath away. The 10 by 20 space was arranged like a furniture showroom. A dining table sat in the center, made from cherry wood so perfectly finished it seemed to glow in the afternoon light. 6 matching chairs surrounded the table, each one carved with a different pattern of leaves and flowers. Against the far wall stood a bookcase with glass doors, the shelves already lined with leather-bound volumes. Everything was tagged. White cards, tied with string, each one written in Tom's careful handwriting. For Clara's birthday, for our first house, for the children we'll have someday, for when we're old and gray. There were 37 pieces in all. A bedroom set, a rocking chair, a corner desk with hidden drawers, a chest carved with their wedding date. Clara walked from piece to piece, running her hands over surfaces that were silk smooth under her fingers. Tom had made all of this in secret, working in the back room of Earl's store after hours, crafting a house full of furniture for the life they'd planned but never lived. Each piece was perfect, joined without nails or screws, finished with oil that brought out every grain pattern in the wood. But the furniture was only part of what Earl had hidden in the storage unit. Behind the bookcase, Clara found filing cabinets filled with documents, savings bonds in her name, purchased every month for 7 years. Bank statements showing an account she'd never known about, with a balance that made her sit down hard on Tom's rocking chair. Insurance policies, stock certificates. The deed to 12 acres of land adjoining Earl's store, land that had been in the Whitfield family for 4 generations. At the bottom of the last filing cabinet was a manila folder labeled, "For Clara, Final Letter." Inside was an envelope addressed in Earl's handwriting, but thicker than the others, with pages that rustled when she lifted it. Clara carried the letter outside and sat on the tailgate of her truck. The sun was beginning to set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She opened the envelope and unfolded 6 pages of Earl's careful cursive. My dear Clara, if you found this letter, you've seen the furniture Tom made for you, and you found the money I saved. And you're probably wondering why I kept all of this secret for so long. The answer is shame, Clara. Pure and simple shame at the way I let fear make my decisions for too many years. Tom wanted to marry you the day after you met. He came home from your first date and told me he'd found the woman he was going to spend his life with. He was 21 years old and worked up the courage to ask me for my grandmother's engagement ring. I told him he was too young, that he needed to think practical, that marriage was a serious business that required serious planning. So he waited. For 3 years he waited, saving money and learning the business and trying to prove to me that he was ready to be a husband. And you waited with him, working double shifts at the diner and never complaining, never pressuring him, just loving him while he figured out how to be brave enough to disappoint me. The night before he asked you to marry him, Tom stayed up until dawn in the workshop behind the store. He was making your engagement ring box, carving your initials into a piece of walnut he'd been saving since high school. He asked me if I thought you'd say yes. I told him any woman would be lucky to have him, but I never told him what I really thought, which was that he was the one who was lucky. Lucky to find someone who loved him for who he was, instead of who he might become. Lucky to find someone who saw potential instead of problems. Lucky to find someone who understood that building something beautiful takes time and patience and faith that the work will matter to somebody. I never told Tom any of that because I was afraid that if I encouraged him too much, he'd leave the store and move away, and I'd lose the only son who ever showed interest in carrying on what my father had started. So I kept him close by making him doubt himself. I kept him close by making him think love was something you had to earn instead of something you had to give. After Tom died in that accident, I wanted to tell you all of this. I wanted to explain why he'd been working such long hours, why he'd been driving to job sites in bad weather, why he'd taken on more work than one person could handle. He was trying to save enough money to buy out my share of the store. He was trying to prove he could support a family. He was trying to become the man I'd convinced him he needed to be instead of celebrating the man he already was. The worst part is that he'd been building your life together piece by piece, every evening in that workshop, every weekend when you thought he was just tinkering with wood. The dining room table he finished 2 weeks before he died. The bed he was carving headboards for. The crib he started when you told him you wanted children someday. All of it hidden because he wanted to surprise you, because he thought love was something you demonstrated with grand gestures instead of daily choices. Margaret never knew about the money I saved for you and Tom. Every month for 7 years, I took 10% of the store's profit and put it in an account with both your names. I told myself I was being practical, helping you get started. But really, I was trying to buy forgiveness for all the ways I'd failed as a father-in-law. I never spent time with you, Clara. Never asked about your dreams or your plans or what you thought about when you looked out the window. Never treated you like family because I was afraid that if I loved you too much, I'd have to admit how badly I'd treated my own son. Never stood up to Margaret when she made those comments about your background, your job, your clothes. Because standing up to her would have meant admitting that I'd married someone who thought love was a competition instead of a collaboration. Tom died believing that you deserved better than what he could give you. He died believing that he hadn't done enough, saved enough, built enough to make you happy. The truth is that you made him happier than he'd ever been in his life, and I was too proud and too scared to tell him so. The store is yours now, along with everything that should have been yours 7 years ago. The furniture Tom made with his own hands. The money I saved because I couldn't find the words to say I was sorry. The land that will be yours to pass on to children or grandchildren or whoever needs a place to start over. But mostly, Clara, I'm leaving you the truth. Tom loved you every single day of his life, from the moment you walked into the diner until the moment he died on that rain-slicked road. He loved you when you were tired from working double shifts. He loved you when you sang off-key in the shower. He loved you when you cried at movies, and when you laughed at his terrible jokes, and when you fell asleep on his shoulder during Sunday afternoon baseball games. He loved you when he was afraid, and when he was confident, and when he was making plans for the future you'd share. He loved you enough to spend 3 years carving your life together out of raw wood, shaping it and sanding it and finishing it until it was strong enough to last forever. I loved you too, Clara, though I never found the courage to say so while I was alive. I loved watching Tom become the man I'd always hoped he'd be when he was with you. I loved seeing him laugh more and worry less and take pride in work that mattered. I loved knowing that when I died, the store would go to someone who understood that a business is really just a way of taking care of people. Open the store, Clara. Fill it with the sound of customers and the smell of coffee and the satisfaction of fixing what's broken. Hang Tom's picture behind the counter where everyone can see it. Use the furniture he made for you. Live the life he spent 3 years building piece by piece in secret, and know that every morning when you unlock the front door, every evening when you balance the till, Every time you help someone find exactly what they need, Tom will be there with you. Love doesn't end when people die, Clara. It just changes form, becomes something you can build on and pass along to the next person who needs somewhere to start. I loved you every single day, from the moment Tom brought you home to meet us until the moment I'm writing these words. I just didn't know how to show it until it was too late to matter. With all my love and all my regrets, Earl Whitfield, P.S. The key to Tom's workshop is taped under the counter beside the hidden panel. He would want you to have it. Clara sat on the tailgate as darkness fell around her, reading Earl's letter 3 times before folding it carefully and putting it back in the envelope. The storage unit stood open behind her, full of furniture that Tom had made during the evenings when she'd thought he was just puttering around in Earl's workshop. 7 years of marriage, and she'd never known he was building their entire life together, one dovetail joint at a time. She thought about the money in the filing cabinets, more than enough to reopen the store and modernize the inventory, and maybe even expand into the empty building next door. She thought about the 12 acres of land that adjoined the store, land where Tom had probably imagined building a house someday, where their children might have played among the oak trees and learned to fish in Willow Creek. But mostly, she thought about the workshop key taped under the counter and what she might find in the space where Tom had spent his last 3 years creating something beautiful for a future he'd never lived to see. If you've made it this far into Clara's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Clara was locking up the storage unit when the car pulled into the gravel lot behind her. A black sedan with tinted windows and plates she didn't recognize. The engine shut off and a man in an expensive suit climbed out, checking his phone as he walked toward her. Mrs. Whitfield? He was maybe 40, with the kind of haircut that cost more than Clara made in a week at the diner. I'm Richard Castellanos with Piedmont Development Group. He handed her a business card embossed with silver lettering. I represent a client who's interested in purchasing your property on Route 9. Clara slipped the card into her pocket without reading it. The store's not for sale. I understand you inherited it recently. My condolences. Castellanos smiled, but his eyes stayed cold. These old buildings can be a real burden. Heating costs, property taxes, zoning compliance. We're prepared to make a very generous offer. I said it's not for sale. Castellanos pulled out his phone and showed her a map. My client is developing a retail complex just outside Cedar Falls. Anchor stores, chain restaurants, plenty of parking. Your location would be perfect for a satellite facility. Clara looked at the map. The proposed development covered 400 acres of farmland along Route 9, including the hills behind Earl's store. What happens to the existing businesses? Progress, Mrs. Whitfield. Cedar Falls needs modern retail options if it wants to attract young families, grow the tax base. Castellanos put his phone away. You could use the money from the sale to relocate somewhere more suitable, maybe closer to family. The store is my family. Castellanos' smile faded. Mrs. Whitfield, I've done some research. You have no experience in retail, no capital for improvements, no established customer base. Whitfield Hardware has been closed for 3 years. The building needs significant repairs just to meet current code requirements. Clara walked to her truck and opened the driver's door. Like I said, it's not for sale. My client is very persistent, Castellanos called after her, and there are zoning hearings coming up that could affect your property values significantly. It would be unfortunate if you found yourself with a building you couldn't legally operate. Clara started the truck and backed out of the parking lot, leaving Castellanos standing beside his sedan in a cloud of gravel dust. In her rearview mirror, she watched him make a phone call before getting back in his car and driving toward town. The drive back to the store took longer than usual. Clara kept checking her mirrors, but the black sedan didn't follow. She pulled into the gravel lot and sat in her truck for a moment, looking at Earl's building in the moonlight. The tilted sign, the peeling paint, the windows that needed cleaning, but also the solid brick foundation, the hand-forged hinges on the front door, the careful joinery in the porch railings that Tom had probably repaired a dozen times. Inside, Clara walked straight to the hidden panel behind the counter. She found the workshop key exactly where Earl had said it would be, taped to the underside of the countertop. The key was smaller than the others, brass like the rest, with workshop etched into the metal in Tom's careful lettering. Clara had always assumed the workshop was just a storage room filled with Earl's old projects and broken equipment. Now she understood it was something else entirely. The place where Tom had spent his evenings building the life he'd planned to share with her. The place where he'd carved and joined and finished their future one piece at a time. She turned on the lights and walked through the store to the back room. Behind stacks of paint cans and motor oil, a narrow door stood closed with a brass lock that looked newer than the rest of the hardware in the building. Clara fit the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened inward, and she stepped into Tom's workshop for the first time. The smell hit her first. Cedar shavings and linseed oil, and the faint sweetness of wood glue. Then the silence, different from the rest of the building, muffled by thick walls and heavy workbenches. And finally the light, from a single window that looked out over the hills behind the store. The same hills where Tom had probably imagined building their house. The workshop was smaller than the storage unit, but felt larger somehow, filled with the presence of someone who'd spent countless hours here shaping wood and dreams into something solid and permanent. Tom's tools hung in perfect order on pegboard walls, hand planes arranged by size, chisels sharp enough to shave paper, measuring squares and marking gauges, and carving knives, maintained with the kind of care that came from daily use. But it was the workbench that made Clara's hands shake as she reached out to touch it. On the scarred wooden surface sat an unfinished cradle, half assembled and waiting for the careful joints that would make it strong enough to hold a sleeping child. The wood was maple, pale and close-grained, cut and shaped and sanded to silk smoothness. Beside it lay Tom's hand-drawn plans, covered with notes and measurements and small sketches of decorative details. At the bottom of the plans, in Tom's familiar handwriting, "For the babies Clara and I will have someday. Started October 15th, hope to finish by Christmas morning, if I can keep it secret that long." Clara sank into the wooden chair beside the workbench, still holding Tom's plans against her chest. The date on the cradle plans was 2 weeks before Tom died. 2 weeks before the rainy morning when he'd left early for a job site and never came home. He'd been planning to surprise her with a piece of furniture for children they'd never had. Children they'd talked about in the abstract, but never quite found the courage to try for. Now she understood why Tom had been working such long hours those last months. Why he'd seemed distracted and tired, but also somehow more hopeful than he'd been in years. Why he'd kissed her extra long on the morning he died, as if he was holding on to something beautiful that he couldn't wait to share. Clara set the plans on the workbench and looked around the workshop one more time. This was where Tom's love had lived, in the patient work of shaping something lasting out of raw materials. This was where he'd spent his evenings building their future piece by piece, creating beauty for a life they'd never get to live together. But the cradle wasn't finished. The joints weren't glued. The final sanding wasn't done. The protective finish hadn't been applied. Tom's last project sat waiting for someone to complete what he'd started, to turn his careful plans into something real and useful and strong enough to last. Clara picked up one of Tom's hand planes and felt the weight of it in her palm. The tool was perfectly balanced, the blade honed to a razor edge, the wooden handle worn smooth by years of careful use. Tomorrow she would start learning to use it. Tomorrow she would start learning to finish what Tom had begun. Tonight she would sleep in Earl's narrow bed above the store, surrounded by the sounds of a building that had sheltered 3 generations of Whitfields. Tomorrow she would figure out how to fight Richard Castellanos and his development plans. Tomorrow she would start turning Earl's inheritance into something Tom would have been proud of. But first she would sit in Tom's workshop and listen to the silence that held the echo of his hands working wood, shaping dreams into something solid enough to build a life on. Clara woke to the sound of gravel crunching in the parking lot. Through the small window above Earl's bed, she could see a white van pulling up to the front of the store. The van had official plates and a county seal on the door. A woman in a brown uniform climbed out, carrying a clipboard and an envelope. Clara dressed quickly and hurried downstairs. The woman was already taping something to the front door when Clara unlocked it from the inside. "Clara Whitfield?" The woman held out the envelope. "You've been served." Clara took the envelope and watched the van drive away. Her name was typed on the front in official letters. Clara Marie Whitfield, owner-operator, Whitfield Hardware. Below that, in red ink, "Urgent, legal notice." She tore open the envelope and unfolded 3 pages of legal documents. The letterhead read, "Castellanos and Associates, Attorneys at Law." Clara skipped the dense paragraphs of legal language and found the important parts. Petition for immediate rezoning review. Unsafe building conditions. Public health and safety concerns. At the bottom of the 3rd page, a date circled in red. Hearing scheduled for November 15th, 9 a.m. Cedar Falls Municipal Building. Today was November 12th. She had 3 days. Clara read through the petition more carefully. Castellanos wasn't trying to force her to sell. He was trying to have the building condemned. The petition claimed that Whitfield Hardware violated current fire codes, lacked proper handicapped access, and posed a public safety risk due to structural deficiencies and outdated electrical systems. If the municipal board agreed, Clara would be forced to either spend tens of thousands of dollars on renovations or tear down the building entirely. Either way, she'd lose the store. Clara sat in Tom's workshop chair and counted the money she had left. $37 in her wallet, plus whatever was in the bank accounts Earl had set up. Even with Earl's savings, she didn't have enough to fight a legal battle and renovate the building and restock the store. She could sell the furniture Tom had made, but that felt like betraying everything he'd worked for. She could sell the 12 acres of land, but that would mean giving up the future he'd planned for them. Or she could just walk away. The thought came quietly, without drama or self-pity. She could load her duffel bag into the truck and drive back to the city and start over somewhere else. Find another job, another apartment, another life that didn't require her to fight developers and building inspectors and the ghosts of people who'd loved her better than she'd known. Margaret and David would probably be relieved. Rose and Frank would understand. The store had been closed for 3 years. No one would blame her for keeping it that way. Clara picked up the cradle plans and studied Tom's careful measurements. The project was maybe 60% complete. The sides were cut and shaped, the rockers carved and sanded smooth. But the critical joints weren't glued, the assembly wasn't finished, and without Tom's expertise, she'd probably ruin the whole thing if she tried to complete it. Just like the store. Just like everything else Tom and Earl had left her. Clara was still sitting in the workshop when she heard a truck pull into the parking lot. Through the window, she could see Rose Brennan climbing out of an old Ford pickup, carrying a thermos and a white paper bag. "Brought lunch," Rose said when Clara opened the front door. "Frank told me about the legal notice. Half the town saw the county van this morning." They sat at the counter and ate Rose's sandwiches while Clara explained about Castellanos and the development company and the hearing scheduled for Friday. Rose listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or shaking her head. "Building inspector came by our place last month," Rose said finally. "Same complaints, fire codes, handicapped access, structural issues. Frank had to install a wheelchair ramp and update the electrical panel. Cost us $8,000. I don't have $8,000. Neither did we. Frank borrowed against the business, figured we'd pay it back over time. Rose finished her coffee and screwed the cap back on the thermos. But that's not really what this is about. What do you mean? Castellanos has been sniffing around Cedar Falls for 2 years, buying up farmland, pressuring business owners, making offers to anyone who'll listen. He wants to turn this whole valley into strip malls and chain stores. Rose stood up and walked to the front window. Some people think that's progress. Others think it's the end of everything that makes this place worth living in. Clara joined Rose at the window. Across the parking lot, a red-tailed hawk circled above the pasture where black cattle grazed in the afternoon sun. Earl said in his letter that the store was a way of taking care of people. Earl was right. Hardware stores aren't really about selling screws and paint. They're about helping people fix what's broken, build what's needed, maintain what matters. Rose turned away from the window. But you can't run a store by yourself, especially not while you're learning the business. I know. That's why I'm thinking about giving up. Rose's voice was gentle but firm. I can see it in your face, Clara. You're doing the math and deciding it's impossible. Clara didn't deny it. Maybe Margaret and David were right. Maybe I don't know enough to make this work. Rose walked behind the counter and ran her hand along the wooden surface. Earl spent 40 years building relationships in this valley. Frank and I spent 35 years building ours. Tom spent his whole life learning how to fix things and make them last. She looked up at Clara. You think any of us knew what we were doing when we started? Before Clara could answer, another vehicle pulled into the parking lot. This one was smaller, older, a sedan with primer spots and a loose muffler. A young woman got out, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. She walked to the front door and knocked hesitantly. Clara opened the door. The woman was thin, tired-looking, with a bruise on her left wrist that she kept trying to hide under her sleeve. I'm sorry to bother you, the woman said. I saw the hardware store sign and I was wondering. I don't have much money, but I need some basic tools. I'm trying to fix a window that won't close, and the landlord says it's not his problem. What kind of tools? Clara asked. I don't really know. A screwdriver, maybe? Something to tighten the screws. The woman looked embarrassed. My husband always took care of things like that, but he's not around anymore. Clara looked at Rose, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Come in. Let's see what you need. The woman's name was Amy Garrett. She'd driven up from Virginia with her 5-year-old daughter, running from an ex-husband who'd decided that divorce papers didn't mean he couldn't still control her life. They were staying in a furnished room above Murphy's Tavern, the kind of place that rented by the week and didn't ask too many questions. The window in our room sticks, Amy explained. Won't close all the way, and it's getting cold at night. My daughter has asthma, and the draft makes her cough. Clara had never diagnosed window problems before, but Tom had taught her to listen carefully when people described what was broken. She walked Amy through the tool section, explaining the difference between Phillips head and flathead screwdrivers, showing her how to identify different types of screws, demonstrating how to use a level to check if a window frame was square. Most window problems are caused by settling or moisture, Clara said, parroting something she'd heard Tom say years ago. If the frame is out of square, you might need to plane the sash. If the hardware is loose, you might just need to tighten the screws or replace them with longer ones. Amy listened intently, asking questions and taking notes on the back of an envelope. When they finished, Clara gathered up a basic toolkit: screwdrivers, a small plane, a set of wood screws, a tube of caulk, and a roll of weather stripping. How much do I owe you? Amy asked. Clara looked at the tools spread across the counter. If she was going to lose the store anyway, did it matter whether she made money today? $25. Amy counted out bills from a small envelope. I really appreciate this. Most places, they look at me like I'm stupid for not knowing about tools. Tools are just tools, Clara said, echoing something Earl had written in one of his letters. What matters is being willing to learn how to use them. After Amy left, Rose helped Clara inventory the store's existing stock. They found gaps everywhere. The electrical section was missing basic wire nuts and outlet boxes. The plumbing supplies were down to odd fittings that didn't match standard sizes, and the tool selection looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1990s. But they also found treasures. Boxes of brass hinges and vintage door hardware. Hand tools that were better made than anything you could buy today. Specialty items that modern stores didn't carry because they weren't profitable enough. Earl always said hardware stores were like libraries, Rose explained as they checked expiration dates on caulk tubes. You don't just stock what sells fast. You stock what people need, even if they only need it once every 10 years. By evening, Clara had a clearer picture of what reopening the store would require. New inventory, updated electrical systems, a wheelchair ramp, modern point-of-sale equipment, business license, insurance policies, and advertising to let people know Whitfield Hardware was open again. Even with Earl's savings, she was looking at months of work and tens of thousands of dollars in startup costs. And she had 3 days before the county hearing that could shut her down permanently. Clara was locking up when she heard footsteps on the gravel parking lot. Frank Brennan emerged from the darkness, carrying a toolbox and wearing the kind of work clothes that suggested he'd come to do more than just talk. "Rose told me about the legal trouble," he said. "Figured you might need some help getting this place up to code." "Mr. Brennan, I can't afford to pay for renovations. Didn't ask you to pay." Frank set down his toolbox and pulled out a folding rule. "Earl Whitfield helped me out more times than I can count. Never asked for anything in return. Never kept track of favors. Time to return the kindness." Before Clara could object, Frank was measuring the width of the front door and making notes in a pocket notebook. "Door's 30 inches wide. Code requires 36 for handicapped access. But if we widen the frame and rehang the door, you'll meet the requirement without changing the look of the building." "I don't understand." Building inspector who wrote that citation is Dave Morrison. Good man, fair man, but he has to follow the rules. Frank folded his rule and put it back in his pocket. "Thing is, Dave knows the difference between a safety hazard and a technicality. You fix the real problems, he'll work with you on the paperwork." Frank pulled a cell phone from his shirt pocket and dialed a number. "Dave? Frank Brennan. I'm out at Earl Whitfield's place with his daughter-in-law." "Yeah, the citation you wrote. Tomorrow morning? We'll be ready." He hung up and looked at Clara. "Dave's coming by at 8 a.m. tomorrow to do another inspection. If we work tonight, we can have the major issues fixed by then." "We?" Frank's smile reminded Clara of Earl's letters, of the way people in Cedar Falls seemed to understand that helping neighbors wasn't charity. It was just what you did when someone needed help. "Rose is bringing her nephew Jimmy. He's an electrician. My son-in-law Rob is a plumber. Amy Patterson, who runs the garden center, is coming with her husband to build the wheelchair ramp." Frank opened his toolbox and pulled out a cordless drill. "Earl spent 40 years helping people in this valley. Tonight we return the favor." They started arriving before Clara had finished her coffee the next morning. Jimmy Brennan in a van loaded with electrical supplies. Rob Martinez with pipe fittings and a new GFCI outlet for the bathroom. Amy and Ed Patterson with lumber and power tools for building the ramp. By 9 o'clock, Whitfield Hardware looked like a construction site, with people working in every corner of the building. Clara tried to help, but mostly she felt in the way. These people knew exactly what needed to be done and how to do it efficiently. Jimmy rewired the main electrical panel in 2 hours. Rob replaced the old galvanized water pipes with modern copper. The Pattersons built a wheelchair ramp that looked like it had always been part of the building's design, but the most surprising arrival came just before noon, when Amy Garrett pulled into the parking lot with her 5-year-old daughter. "I fixed the window," Amy announced, holding up Clara's borrowed tools. "Turned out the screws were stripped. I replaced them with longer ones, just like you said." Amy's daughter, a serious little girl named Sophie, stayed close to her mother's side but watched everything with curious eyes. When Clara offered her a juice box from Rose's cooler, Sophie whispered, "Thank you," and sat on the front steps to drink it. "I was thinking," Amy said quietly, "about what you said yesterday, about being willing to learn." She gestured toward the busy scene inside the store. "I don't know anything about hardware stores, but I'm good with organizing an inventory and talking to customers. If you need help. I can't afford to pay anyone right now. I'm not asking for pay. I'm asking for a chance." Amy's voice was steady but determined. "Sophie and I need a place to start over. You need someone who understands what it's like to fix something that's broken." Clara looked at Sophie, who was sharing her juice box with a stray cat that had wandered up from the creek. "What about your ex-husband?" "He doesn't know where we are, and even if he finds us, I'm not running anymore." Amy met Clara's eyes. "Some things are worth fighting for." By Thursday evening, Whitfield Hardware looked like a different place. The electrical system was updated and code compliant. The plumbing worked perfectly. The new wheelchair ramp blended seamlessly with the original architecture. Fresh paint covered the walls, and the floors had been swept and mopped until they gleamed. But more important than the physical improvements was what Clara had learned about her neighbors. Jimmy Brennan mentioned that Earl had given him his first job when he was 16 and just out of juvenile detention. Rob Martinez talked about the time Earl had stayed open late to sell him emergency plumbing supplies during a Christmas Eve pipe burst. Amy Patterson's husband, Ed, revealed that Earl had quietly paid his medical bills when cancer treatment forced him to close his landscaping business for 6 months. "Earl never talked about any of that," Frank said as they cleaned up the tools. "Never wanted credit, never kept score. Just helped people when they needed help and went about his business." Friday morning, Clara stood in front of the Cedar Falls Municipal Building, wearing her best dress and carrying a folder full of inspection reports and building permits. Dave Morrison had signed off on all the electrical and plumbing work. The fire department had approved the new exit signs and smoke detectors. Even the health department had cleared the small bathroom and the coffee station Rose had installed near the register. Castellanos was already in the hearing room when Clara arrived, wearing another expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He nodded politely but didn't speak. His assistant, a young woman with perfectly styled hair, spread documents across the table like weapons. The municipal board consisted of 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, all in their 50s or 60s, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else on a Friday morning. The chairman, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, read the petition aloud in a monotone voice that made the legal language sound even more intimidating. The petitioner alleges that the property known as Whitfield Hardware poses significant safety and health risks to the public, he read. The building allegedly violates current fire codes, lacks proper handicapped access, and contains structural deficiencies that make it unsuitable for commercial use. Castellanos stood up and gave a polished presentation about public safety and legal liability and the need for modern building standards. He showed photographs of the old electrical panel, the narrow front door, the uneven wooden floors. He cited fire codes and disability laws and building standards that had been updated since Earl's building was constructed. The responsible thing, Castellanos concluded, is to condemn this structure before someone gets hurt. Clara's hands shook as she stood up to respond. She'd never spoken in front of a government board before, never had to defend herself against a lawyer who did this kind of thing for a living. But she thought about Tom's workshop and Earl's letters and the way her neighbors had shown up to help without being asked. "I brought new inspection reports," she said, handing copies to each board member. "The electrical system has been updated to current code. We've installed handicapped access and new safety equipment. The building inspector has signed off on all the work." The board members studied the reports while Clara waited. Finally, the chairman looked up. "These inspections are dated yesterday, Mrs. Whitfield. The work was completed after the petition was filed." "Yes, sir. I wanted to address any legitimate safety concerns," Castellanos objected. "The petitioner requests that the original conditions be considered, not improvements made in response to this hearing." "The board will consider the current condition of the property," the chairman said firmly. "That's our standard procedure." But Clara could see that the legal technicalities were getting complicated, that the board was uncomfortable making a decision that could set precedent for future cases. She was about to lose, not because she was wrong, but because the system favored people like Castellanos, who knew how to navigate bureaucratic procedures. That's when the hearing room door opened and Frank Brennan walked in, followed by Rose and Jimmy and Rob and the Pattersons and a dozen other people Clara had never seen before. Frank walked to the front of the room and stood beside Clara. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak on behalf of Mrs. Whitfield, if that's allowed." "Are you her attorney?" "No, sir. I'm her neighbor, and I'm speaking for all the neighbors Earl Whitfield helped over the years." Frank gestured toward the people filling the back of the room. "We'd like to tell you what Whitfield Hardware has meant to this community." The chairman looked uncertain, but one of the women on the board nodded. "I think we should hear from the community." For the next 20 minutes, Clara listened to people tell stories she'd never heard before. A farmer whose tractor had broken down during harvest season, leaving him facing financial ruin until Earl opened the store at midnight to sell him the replacement part he needed. A single mother whose kitchen faucet had burst on Christmas Eve, soaking her apartment and threatening to ruin her children's presents, until Earl drove to her house with repair supplies and fixed it himself, refusing payment. An elderly man with a walker stood up slowly. "Earl Whitfield never charged me full price for anything in 30 years. Always found a reason to give me a discount. Scratched packaging, discontinued item, customer return. I knew what he was doing, but he let me keep my dignity by pretending it was just business." Amy Patterson talked about the plants and soil amendments Earl had donated to the community garden behind the elementary school. Rob Martinez mentioned the free plumbing advice Earl had given to young homeowners who couldn't afford professional repairs. Jimmy Brennan explained how Earl had co-signed his first apartment lease when no one else would trust a kid with a juvenile record. "You want to know about safety?" Rose Brennan said when it was her turn to speak. "Earl Whitfield made this valley safer by helping people maintain their homes and fix their problems before they became emergencies. He made it safer by giving people hope when they didn't have money or resources or anywhere else to turn." When the testimony was finished, the room was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. The board members looked uncomfortable, as if they'd expected a routine hearing about building codes and instead found themselves judging the value of a man's entire life. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Castellanos, do you have any response to this testimony?" Castellanos stood up, but for the first time since Clara had met him, he seemed uncertain. "The emotional testimony is moving," he said carefully. "But the law requires us to consider objective safety standards, not subjective community feelings." "The law also allows us to consider the public interest," the chairman replied. "And based on the new inspection reports and the testimony we've heard today, it seems clear that Whitfield Hardware serves an important public interest." The vote was 4-1 in Clara's favor. The single dissenting vote came from a man who explained that he was concerned about setting a precedent that might complicate future development projects. But even he acknowledged that Clara had addressed all the legitimate safety concerns. Castellanos packed his briefcase without speaking to anyone and left through the back door of the hearing room. His assistant followed, clicking across the tile floor in high heels that echoed like gunshots. Outside the municipal building, the neighbors who had testified gathered around Clara in the parking lot. Frank shook her hand solemnly. Rose gave her a quick hug. Jimmy promised to check the electrical system every few months to make sure everything stayed up to code. "When are you planning to reopen?" Amy Patterson asked. Clara realized she hadn't thought that far ahead. The hearing had consumed all her attention for the past 3 days. "I guess soon. I need to order new inventory and figure out the business license and—" "Next Saturday," Rose interrupted. "Grand reopening next Saturday morning. That gives us a week to get everything ready." "Us? You don't think we're going to let you do this alone, do you?" Frank smiled. "Earl spent 40 years building this business. We're not going to let it die because you're too polite to ask for help." The next week passed in a blur of activity that reminded Clara of a barn raising she'd seen in an old movie. People appeared at the store every day with supplies and labor and expertise she didn't know she needed. Jimmy installed new light fixtures that made the store bright and welcoming. Rob connected a modern cash register that Rose had donated from her restaurant supply company. The Pattersons planted flowers around the entrance and hung a new sign painted by a local artist. Amy Garrett proved to be as good as her word. She organized the inventory by category and created a simple computer database that tracked stock levels and supplier information. She painted price tags in neat block letters and arranged the displays so everything was easy to find. When customers started stopping by during the week, drawn by curiosity and the activity, Amy helped them find what they needed and made change from the old mechanical register. "She's a natural," Rose told Clara on Thursday evening. "Knows how to listen to what people actually need instead of just trying to sell them something." Clara found Amy in the back room, teaching Sophie how to sort screws by size and thread type. The little girl worked with intense concentration, holding each screw up to the light to examine it before placing it in the correct bin. "Sophie's good at organizing," Amy said. "Helps me stay on top of the small details." "Are you sure you want to stay in Cedar Falls?" Clara asked. "I mean, after everything you've been through." Amy looked out the window toward the hills where Sophie was chasing fireflies in the evening dusk. Sophie's never had a place that felt safe before. Never had neighbors who knew her name or a room that was really hers. She turned back to Clara. "I spent 2 years running from one place to another, thinking safety was something you found by leaving. Turns out safety is something you build by staying." Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost on the grass and steam rising from the coffee cups that Rose brought from the diner. Clara unlocked the front door of Whitfield Hardware at 8 a.m. exactly, just as a hand-painted banner reading "Welcome Back" unfurled above the entrance. The first customer was Dave Morrison, the building inspector who'd written the original citation. He bought a package of furnace filters and a tube of caulk for his bathroom window, then shook Clara's hand and congratulated her on the improvements to the building. By 10 a.m., the store was busy enough that Clara had to call Amy from the back room to help with customers. People came not just to buy things, but to see the renovations and meet the woman who'd inherited Earl's store. Several mentioned that they'd heard about the hearing, that they were glad to see Whitfield Hardware open again. Frank Brennan arrived with a gift, a framed photograph of Earl standing behind the counter on the store's opening day in 1987. Clara hung it on the wall beside the cash register, where everyone could see Earl's proud smile and the carefully arranged shelves behind him. "Looks just like it did 30 years ago," said an older woman who'd driven out from town specifically for the reopening. "Except now there's a young woman behind the counter instead of Earl." The woman bought a package of grass seed and a small watering can, then mentioned that she was Earl's former neighbor, that she'd missed having a hardware store within easy driving distance. "Those big box stores don't know anything about local conditions," she explained. "Earl always knew exactly what kind of fertilizer worked best in our soil, what tools would hold up to heavy use. By noon, Clara had sold more merchandise than she'd expected to move in a week. People bought practical things like extension cords and work gloves, but they also bought items they probably could have gotten cheaper elsewhere. Packets of flower seeds, small hand tools, rolls of duct tape. It seemed like they were buying reasons to visit the store, reasons to support what Earl had started, and Clara was continuing. The surprise came just before closing time, when a young man with a backpack and worn-out shoes knocked on the door. He was maybe 20, thin and nervous, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd been traveling for days. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "I was wondering if you had any work. I can do cleaning, stocking, whatever you need. I don't need much pay, just enough for food and maybe a place to sleep." Clara looked at Amy, who nodded slightly. This was how it had started for both of them, arriving in Cedar Falls with nowhere else to go, hoping someone would give them a chance to prove they could be useful. "What's your name?" Clara asked. Marcus Cole." He shifted his backpack nervously. "I've been staying at the shelter in the city, but they can only keep you for 30 days. I heard there might be work in smaller towns." Clara thought about Earl's letters, about the way love became something you could build on and pass along to the next person who needed somewhere to start. She thought about Amy and Sophie, who'd found safety by staying instead of running. She thought about Tom's unfinished cradle, waiting in the workshop for someone to complete what he'd started. "Can you start Monday morning?" she asked. Marcus's relief was so obvious it made Clara's chest tight. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely. I'll work hard, I promise. Amy will show you around, explain how we organize everything." Clara pulled a $20 bill from the cash register. "There's a room above Murphy's Tavern that rents by the week. Tell Murphy that Clara from the hardware store sent you." After Marcus left, Clara and Amy finished cleaning up from the busy day. Sophie fell asleep in Tom's workshop chair, exhausted from helping customers find the right size screws and washers. Amy carried her daughter upstairs to the small apartment Clara had created in the storage loft, the same space where Earl had lived those last few years. "You don't have to let us stay here," Amy said as they tucked Sophie into bed. "I know we're just supposed to be employees." "Earl's letters said the best thing about fixing something is that it stays fixed," Clara replied. "But I think he was wrong about that. The best thing about fixing something is that it teaches you how to fix the next thing." Clara walked downstairs to Tom's workshop and sat in his chair beside the unfinished cradle. The maple wood glowed golden in the light from the single window, smooth and ready for the final assembly that would turn Tom's careful plans into something real and lasting. She picked up one of his hand planes and tested the weight of it in her palm. Tomorrow she would start learning to use it properly. Tomorrow she would start finishing what Tom had begun, not because she planned to have children, but because some things deserved to be completed simply because someone had loved them enough to start them. Tonight she would sit in the workshop and listen to the sounds of the building settling around her. Amy reading bedtime stories to Sophie in the apartment upstairs, the old refrigerator humming in the back room, the distant sound of cars on Route 9 carrying people to and from the places they called home. Through the window, she could see lights coming on in farmhouses scattered across the valley, the same lights she'd watched on her first night in Cedar Falls. But now those lights didn't represent strangers living separate lives. They represented customers and neighbors and friends, people who'd shown up when she needed help. People who understood that businesses were really just ways of taking care of each other. Clara set Tom's plane on the workbench beside his plans for the cradle. Monday, she would teach Marcus how to organize inventory and help customers find what they needed. Next month, she would expand the store's hours and add new product lines that people had requested. Next spring, she might use Earl's savings to buy the empty building next door, create space for the workshops and classes that Tom had dreamed about offering. But all of that was future work, built on the foundation that Earl and Tom had laid, and the community had helped her restore. Tonight was for sitting quietly and appreciating what had already been fixed, what had already been saved, what had already been passed along to the next person who needed somewhere to start. The best thing about fixing something isn't that it stays fixed. It's that once you know how to fix one thing, you can learn to fix almost anything else. Clara turned off the workshop light and walked through the store one more time, checking that everything was secure for the night. Earl's photograph smiled down from the wall beside the cash register. Tom's tools hung in perfect order on the pegboard. Amy's neat price tags marked every item on the shelves. Outside, a soft rain had started to fall, pattering against the windows and drumming on the metal roof. Clara locked the front door and climbed the stairs to Earl's room, where she kept a few of her things, but spent most evenings reading his letters by lamplight. Tonight she didn't need to read them. Tonight she understood what Earl had been trying to tell her about love and work, and the way some gifts only revealed their true value when you had the courage to use them instead of just keeping them safe. Clara turned off the lamp and listened to the rain falling on the hills behind the store, on the 12 acres where Tom had imagined building their house, on the whole valley that had become her home, not because she'd been born there, but because people had made room for her when she needed room most. The rain fell on Whitfield Hardware like a blessing, like a promise that some things last because people choose to make them last, because someone always steps forward, when stepping forward is what love looks like.